Okay, welcome everybody to our first professional development series hosted by the South Australian branch of HERDSA. I'm Dr. Sarah Hatton. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of South Australia. I teach in the enabling program at UniSA, and it gives me great joy to welcome our panellists today to talk about the very important topic of whether changing definitions of scholarship will impact on our sector. And we have scholars from the UK. We have our president, Denise Chalmers, and we also have Greg Simmons, who is the Director of Policy and Analysis at TEQSA. And for those who may have read my invitation or have been across what TEQSA has kind of inspired in terms of their discussion paper around the meanings of scholarship, it's kind of brought us all here today. So before I formally introduce everybody, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. We respectfully acknowledge the Kaurna, Boandik and Bangala First Nations peoples and their elders past and present, who are the First Nations traditional owners of the land that are now home to the University of South Australia's campuses in Adelaide, Mount Gambier and Whyalla. So we have an hour and a half with each other today, and our speakers have very kindly agreed to talk 15 minutes each, and we will start with Greg, follow through with Denise, and then John and Rachel, who will give us a UK perspective. But just to give formal introductions, President of HERDSA, Denise Chalmers, Professor Emeritus in the field of higher education, teaching and learning at the University of Western Australia, was awarded an OLT National Senior Teaching Fellowship on recognising and rewarding university teaching in 2015, and an Australian Awards for University Teaching citation for outstanding contributions to student learning in 2014. So thank you for joining us, Denise. Dr. John Canning is a Principal Lecturer in Learning and Teaching in Higher Education at the University of Brighton, a HEA Senior Fellow and Fellow of the Staff and Educational Development Association. Dr. Canning is committed to working with lecturers to become better teachers through continuous professional development opportunities. Dr. Rachel Masika is a global development consultant with 10 years experience of conducting research into learning, teaching and educational development. Rachel was a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Learning and Teaching at the University of Brighton, researching higher education and student experiences. She's a social scientist who draws on multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives of and approaches to understanding student engagement and success, widening participation, teaching excellence, and research capacity building. Her research interests include enhancing student learning outcomes and the quality of teaching, higher education pedagogic research, policy and impact, and equity in higher education, including gender. She has published extensively in both higher education and international development fields. And Greg Simmons joined TEQSA in May 2017 and leads the TEQSA Policy and Analysis Group. The Policy and Analysis Group is responsible for the enhancement of TEQSA's outcomes and future direction through ongoing improvements to regulatory policy, business improvement, strategic projects, and quantitative and qualitative analysis. Prior to joining TEQSA, Greg worked as Executive Director at the Australian Technical and Management College, and before that, Associate Dean at Federation University's Business School. He was the inaugural director of the Federation University Centre for University Partnerships and has over a decade's experience as a lecturer in mathematics and computer science before that with the University of Ballarat. So thank you very much. We have a very special panel to talk about this very important topic. And so I will stop sharing. And Denise, do you have a PowerPoint? Oh, sorry, Greg, sorry. Sorry,
That's
Greg.
okay.
I've just messed everybody up already. Greg, do you have a PowerPoint?
No, I don't. I'm just going to talk from some brief notes, if that's okay.
Okay. Well, I'll just leave that welcome slide up then.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for participating today, making some time. I hope we've got some time at the end for an engaged conversation and some questions. It will certainly be quite helpful for TEQSA, and I think it's something I find personally interesting and enjoy as well. So I hope we can have that sort of conversation at the end. So I'll make some preliminary comments around how why TEQSA produces guidance notes, our process for reviewing guidance notes, which led to the discussion paper, and then the particular discussion paper on scholarship, the principles that underpin that, and what we plan to do with the feedback that we've received late last year. So firstly, on guidance notes, TEQSA publishes a range of guidance notes, and we do that essentially to provide greater clarity to providers with respect to how we interpret the standards that everyone is required to comply with. So there is around about 180 providers who are registered by TEQSA. So obviously universities make up 42 of those. The majority of providers are not universities who we register. And all providers, including universities, are required to meet the standards to essentially continue to operate as a higher education provider in the sector. TEQSA's job's essentially to ensure that those standards are met. The standards themselves are written in a way which I think are open to interpretation and can be quite subjective. And we've found repeatedly through our engagement with the providers who we regulate that guidance notes are welcomed. They give providers an opportunity to understand what TEQSA is looking for when we're looking for evidence of compliance with the standards. They're not standards themselves or pseudo standards. It's just how TEQSA interprets those standards and what we look for when providers demonstrate compliance with the standards. Not everyone needs them or uses them, but we're constantly told and consistently told by the majority of providers that they think they're a valuable thing to do. The guidance notes themselves sit with a policy and analysis group at TEQSA, which I'm responsible for another 2 weeks before I move on to something else. And so that's why I'm here today to talk about the guidance note. The guidance notes themselves draw on our regulatory experience and knowledge, and also the knowledge of experts in the higher education sector. So we'll usually commission someone who has specific expertise relating to the standards that the guidance notes focus on. And each guidance note usually focuses on a single topic. In this case, the topic of scholarship. So we will routinely review guidance notes in response to feedback, or where it's obvious through the course of our regulatory work that there's a need to review our current guidance. In this case, it's become apparent through our evidence submitted. So the evidence that's submitted to TEQSA over the course of time from providers in response to our general regular regulatory assessments, that some providers, not all providers, but some providers found it difficult to address standards 3.1.2, which relates to course design, and 3.2.3, which results to staffing. Recognising that scholarship is an area that's both complex and of intrinsic importance to the sector, TEQSA commissioned a discussion paper to be produced, and then we released it for consultation with the sector. And that discussion paper articulated a range of principles that we thought were important in considering scholarship and aspects of scholarship related to the standards. And that consultation process finished in December last year. And our team has been busy summarising the responses that we've got to date, and we'll be sending that up to the TEQSA Commission for consideration before we revise the current guidance note on scholarship, or if we indeed decide to revise the current guidance note on scholarship. In terms of the standards themselves, the word scholarship is used 9 times throughout the higher education standards framework. The current guidance note on scholarship and the subsequent discussion paper generally focuses on 2 standards in particular, and they're those 2 standards relating to course design and staffing that I referred to. And I'll read you those standards in a minute. It's also worth noting that the use of scholarship in the category standards requires all providers to be active in scholarship, and active in a way which informs the teaching and learning in the fields that they offer. So there are different categories of higher education providers that we regulate, university being essentially one category. Higher education providers who are not universities have a separate category. It is essentially a scaffolding in the category standards, if you like. Every provider who's registered needs to be active in scholarship, but as you go up through the category standards and become a university, the intensity of scholarship changes in terms of the language that's used. But there's consistency across the sector in terms of the expectation that scholarship is something that's intrinsic to being a higher education provider and that it informs teaching and learning. So the specific standards that I'm referring to here, I might just, if you indulge me, I'll read them out. So 3.1.2 relates to course design. And I'll read the standard to you now. The content and learning activities of each course of study engage with advanced knowledge and inquiry consistent with the level of study and the expected learning outcomes, including A, current knowledge and scholarship in relevant academic disciplines, and C, emerging concepts that are informed by recent scholarship, current research findings, and where applicable, advances in practice. So the standards relating to course design articulate a very clear expectation that curriculum is informed by scholarship, relevant scholarship. So for that to be occurring, obviously the provider needs to be across appropriate scholarly activity relevant to the discipline that they're teaching in. Needs to be fed into the course design somewhere. And then the second standard relates to staff. So 3.2 relates to staffing, and 3.2.3 is the relevant standard we're talking about here. And it reads as follows: staff with responsibilities for academic oversight and those with teaching and supervisory roles in courses or units of study are equipped for their roles, including having A, knowledge of contemporary developments in the discipline or field, which is informed by continuing scholarship or research or advances in practice. So there's an expectation that staff are involved in scholarly activity, that course design is informed by scholarly activity that's relevant to the discipline, and that the providers themselves through the category standards are engaged in scholarship in a way that informs their teaching and learning. So those three things put together articulate what is the threshold, the benchmark for all higher education providers to be registered and operate in this country. So now that I've discussed the standards briefly, let me just outline the discussion paper which we released last year. So the discussion paper is still available on our website. If you go to TEQSA.gov.au and type scholarship, you'll find it very easily. And the paper describes 5 principles, and there was a number of questions underneath those principles that we posed to people through that consultation paper. So the first principle simply states to provide evidence of scholarship for regulatory purposes, for our purposes, to be able to assess whether you're meeting the standards. The proposed scholarly activity must be consistent with an established typology of scholarship. So we don't specify what typology that is. What we're saying is you need a framework to be able to judge as an institution whether your approach to scholarly activity is effective, and to make sense of it, essentially, to put some kind of cohesive plan around your scholarly activity. So that's the first principle. The second principle in the discussion paper is probably the one that polarised people the most through the consultation period, and that states as follows: evidence of scholarship must include demonstrable links to intended outputs or outcomes of that scholarship, and be accompanied by mechanisms to monitor and evaluate those outputs and outcomes. Now, what we've found in terms of the feedback that we've received is that many people have interpreted that as all scholarly activity must have a measurable output. That's not what we're saying here. We're saying at an institutional level, there should be a way of measuring the output of your scholarly activity. So you should, if you utilize a framework, if you have a plan, any plan should be measurable, and that should actually inform your continual improvement around scholarly activity. So there needs to be some kind of evidence of output that you're able to demonstrate for your own purposes and also for regulatory purposes, so that we can see that scholarly activity is occurring. So most of the feedback we received here was related to this principle. As I said, it was really quite polarizing. Some people were very, very positive about this principle and the questions we posed under it. Some cases, people were very confused, and some cases people thought we're being overly bureaucratic and we're going to kill them with regulation. Principle 3 states activities such as professional and community engagement, professional development, and routine professional artistic practice will not be regarded as scholarship unless they meet the requirements of Principle 1 and 2, i.e. they sit within an established framework for scholarship and that there's some kind of output that comes from it. Here we've got feedback really that TEQSA was taking too narrow a view of scholarship, and that's something that we'll reflect on. This principle was put forward really in response to what we were seeing some groups of providers provide us as evidence, such as CPAs who were keeping current, and that was really the only evidence of scholarship coming up from a provider who's responsible for delivering business programs. So we thought, we saw a pattern of what we would consider as kind of routine professional development being represented as scholarship in isolation, and the principle was articulated around that. But there's obviously some work we need to do in providing some further guidance, because we do recognise that there's a range of professional development activity that also constitutes scholarship. And so the final two principles, if I can grab my notes. Principle 4 stated that providers will be able to present a plan and create an environment of scholarship which is monitored and reviewed, together with an aggregate representation of their involvement in scholarship within the context of the requirements of the Higher Education Standards Framework. So here we've got some, again, quite polarised responses. Some people were quite positive about what we were saying here. Others thought we were increasing regulatory burden and red tape, and why should they have to tell us what their plan is and how do they measure their plan. Some people thought we're being too prescriptive and too narrow. We think it's going to be very difficult for us to assess compliance with the standards if we don't understand what a provider is trying to do and how they're measuring their success in this area. But again, we'll reflect on the feedback that we've received, and we'll feed that into any process of review of the current guidance note on scholarship. And then the final principle, Principle 5, simply states that TEQSA will accept different approaches to scholarship that reflect the nature of the provider. So we recognise that not all providers are the same. It's a very diverse sector. Some are research intensive, some are teaching intensive, some are small niche providers, some have a broad mission. And that different frameworks and different approaches to scholarly activity is actually incredibly important. But what we're looking for is some kind of systematic, some kind of thought process at an institutional level that considers this in a way that makes sense to the actual provider's mission. Not surprisingly, people weren't particularly upset about Principle 5. So they were the 5 principles that we released in the discussion paper, and as I said, a series of questions that sat underneath that. I'll talk briefly about the process we're going to follow from here around what we're going to do with that consultation. But before I do, Sarah was kind enough to share with the panel some questions that have come up as part of the planning for this session, and I thought I might run briefly through the questions that I think are relevant for TEQSA to respond to. So the first one is simply, what does TEQSA's paper mean to your day-to-day work? And my simple answer to that is really it should mean very little to you as academics. Really, your employer should already be meeting the standards. They should already have a way of ensuring that they're meeting the standards and that there's an environment of scholarship wherever you work, and that's fostered and used to improve the student experience. So my expectation is that the vast majority of providers already meet this requirement under the standards, and you're all working in an environment of scholarship. So if that's the case, it should mean very little for individual academics. Is it important to have consistency in our understanding of scholarships? Is one of the other questions that came forward. Well, in my view, only to a point. We should all have an understanding of what it means to be a higher education provider in Australia, and scholarship's an integral part of that. But beyond that, there should be a range of diverse approaches to scholarship, again, consistent with the mission of the provider. Where does this sit with teaching-only academics in Australia? Teaching-only academics, in my view, and I think in TEQSA's view more broadly, are scholars. So scholarship is broader than research. It's not code for research. Teaching-only academics are scholars. They contribute to curriculum design. They can contribute to the advancement of their discipline in a whole host of ways. And we would view them as scholars, provided they're able to operate as scholars within a scholarly environment. And then how does the discussion paper sit with casuals who do most of the teaching? Well, again, I'd say casuals are academics. They benefit and contribute to an environment of scholarship, just like tenured staff. And, I hope that a provider provides casual academics, and we would expect that providers provide casual academics opportunities to participate as scholars and benefit from that environment. Is all scholarship measurable? No. Must it be? No. But some of it should be, and the institution should have a clear approach to, kind of measuring and, continue to encourage that environment. So that's kind of my brief response to those questions. And I'm happy to, have further questions and tease that out further as part of the panel discussion. So just finally from me, in terms of next steps, TEQSA's worked through the feedback that we've received on the discussion paper, and we'll present that to our commission at the end of this month. And then we'll utilise that feedback to consider any revision to the current guidance note. So there's a guidance note that's active and is published already on our website. And then following any revision to the current guidance note, we'll invite further feedback from the sector. So whenever we publish changes to guidance notes, we invite feedback on those changes. Consultation on the discussion is now closed, but if you want to get in touch, feel free to send us an email at standards@teqsa.gov.au. And so my team, the policy analysis team, will receive that, and we'll be happy to respond to any questions you might have. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Greg, and for clarifying a couple of those points there that I think has been very beneficial for all of us. I'll hand over now to Denise. Thank you, Denise. And I don't have the emojis as the host. So when it's 2 minutes to go, Denise, I'll just turn my video back on. Okay?
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks very much, all. Thanks very much, Greg. I think it's really interesting in terms of people's perception of TEQSA. And I really want to congratulate TEQSA for their discussion paper and the principles they've raised. TEQSA, over my experience with working with institutions as an assessor, as a contributor into higher ed, I found TEQSA has consistently framed its guidance and directions about the institutions demonstrating the standards as they have enacted them within their mission and purpose. And I read this discussion paper in very much that same intent. And I think too that when we get to what an institution is meant to demonstrate, and then what it means for the individuals within that sector, within that institution, that's where it gets blurry. And so a couple of things I just wanted to raise about that, because the focus of TEQSA is what is the institution doing and how can it demonstrate it, and does it demonstrate it to the appropriate standard. In some institutions, it gets sort of drizzled down to every individual meeting those standards, which isn't what's intended by TEQSA and shouldn't be. But those sorts of things then get, I guess, distorted a little as to how the institution then expects it to be enacted and how they then feed it up to TEQSA as well. So there was a couple of questions, particularly around the discussion paper, that I thought were under the first principle, where TEQSA proposed that evidence of one scholarship of the Boyer type scholarships needs to be evidenced at least, which is interesting because the Boyer scholarships of discovery, integration, application or teaching are the four, each one in Boyer's thing of equal value, not research with the big R is better than scholarship of any other sort. But it was interesting to say one of those four when all of the scholarship terms essentially relate to teaching and the quality of teaching as well. So it would seem to me that teaching is a required scholarship that needs to be developed and articulated, and that discovery, integration and application are maybe a little bit more variable because not every institution will do discovery or integration or application. So it seemed to me that teaching needed to be a required scholarship to be demonstrated and the others not, regardless of the sort of institution they were. And that led me, because I get involved with a number of private providers that are essentially teaching only. And for a number of those institutions, the curriculum and teaching models are quite tightly developed and managed under the institutional framework. The teachers may have little involvement in devising the course material, the development, or even much freedom in the model of teaching that's utilised. And so while the institutions are able to demonstrate scholarship in curriculum design and teaching models, it raises the question of what scholarship would be expected of the teachers in those contexts. In a university, we have a model of scholarship, and that's often demonstrated by your qualifications and industry experience and so on. That same model doesn't apply so much with private providers, where the model is very determined, and so the staff are often more tutors with several senior teachers that have oversight. So clearly a university understanding to assess those, which is often what happens when people go in to assess, wouldn't be fair if you then required that each of the individual teachers had a particular qualification the same as you might have in a university. So it's a different model. So while TEQSA rightly assesses the institution, the process to drill down to the individual teachers is quite common in universities in particular, but not necessarily the same in private providers. So is there a question of should there be a minimum standard of scholarship for each person who teaches within those institutions? There is in terms of who can teach various levels of courses. So to teach a master's or to teach a bachelor's, you require different qualifications. But is that the only standard we have? Should there be others? And a lot of people are caught up in this quandary as to what sort of scholarship would be expected of them and would be required, and how far do you push the institutional requirements down for demonstrating scholarship onto each individual, and does that absolve each individual from being scholarly in their work and practice? So I think that's, while I don't see anything wrong with the guidance notes or the guidelines, it's how does it then get enacted and interpreted for that. My next point actually relates also to your principle 2, Greg, but my question is somewhat different, and this is more typical of the higher discussion, where quality is typically linked to improvements, as it is in this point. And so as most people know, the history of quality assurance originated in manufacturing and subsequently moved into what became called the new public management quality assurance mechanisms. And that was to describe the focus on proving performance across all public service operations and extended into higher ed with national policies, quality agencies, and oversight of public expenditure. So the requirements of quality models and the use of performance indicators in higher education at the national level are completely ubiquitous now across the international sector. And it's intended to show improvements over time. So my question is, does there ever come a time when things are good enough? And by that, I don't mean passable or just minimal, But I mean, is there a time when putting any more effort into something to improve it is so marginal that the cost benefit's just not there? When is it all right to say something is good and we'll work on maintaining that, but we'll focus on another thing? While this is what we tend to do in practice, and we sort of do it, there's a reluctance to say it. And so I would argue that in universities, there's a lot of effort being put into aspects of activity in higher institutions where improvements are minimal and marginal, where if we were a little bit more upfront, we could say, this is fine, we know it's fine, here's the evidence, but what we're really focusing on now is this aspect. So in theory, we can do that. I know the models allow for that, but it's harder to do in practice to say, no, we're not improving this part of teaching. And so while this is a more overarching quality point, its application is to consider how it applies to scholarship here. Will there ever be a point where it's judged to be enough or sufficient or whatever? But linking it always to improvement, I think it is sort of still brings in that manufacturing model of things can always be improved to the point of where isn't it marginal, and where can we sort of stop and think about it. And so, you know, we can tinker at the edges to improve scholarship this much, but is it actually doing anything? And so we have a lot of course reviews, which are good, but some of them are marginal. So I'm just sort of wondering where there's a point by which improvement can be said, look, we're at a really high standard, let's maintain it. But you know, we don't need to spend too much more time at the moment. That doesn't mean we don't do reviews, check overseas what's happening and so on. So that was just a question. And my final point relates to how scholarship is judged. While TEQSA doesn't limit variation of interpretation, rightly just asking for it to be justified and demonstrated, in practice, the process of quality review has led to more standardisation and variation over time, and that's true across international boundaries. So this is understandable. So the safer option is to remain within the conventional frameworks and interpretations, particularly for institutions on the fringes or newcomers. Those that go outside the common boundaries face greater and deeper scrutiny. The assessors too are typically drawn from those that operate within the boundaries and who may inadvertently send messages on what is right and what's acceptable. Those within the boundaries rarely ask the questions of the practices operating within it. They are taken as right, even though there's very little evidence perhaps to back that. So, you know, the right way to teach is lecturing, or the right way to teach is in small groups, or the right way. There's often not a lot of evidence to back the ways that we understand is the right. Typically, they're the traditional ways. But not necessarily interrogated to see if they're there. So if anyone wants to do something different, then there's a great deal of scrutiny, even though there may be a huge, and they can do it. You know, you present a rationale, you gather the evidence and so on, but anything outside the boundaries get greater scrutiny than things within the boundaries often. So when we think about scholarship and how it's to be reviewed and judged, the question becomes who's going to do the assessing and how can we guard against the tendency to ensure that everyone remains within the old boundaries. And that, I think, then really hits on people who are casuals, who are sessionals, who are perhaps at the margins, or even individuals who do something different are often criticised or not necessarily encouraged to keep doing it because it's outside the boundaries. And so how we judge things tends to bring people back to the middle, and that does stifle creativity. It stifles innovation at the individual level and also at the institutional level. So they are my comments, more, I guess, more global than applicable to individuals. People will know me and my work about rewarding and recognising teaching and ways in which that can happen, and how they can demonstrate their scholarship within a teaching framework. So I won't rehearse any more of that, but I just thought they might be more interesting questions on that boundary between TEQSA and institutional requirements, and how it dribbles and filters down and puts onus on individuals or not, and how that then gets justified and interpreted. So that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. For those that haven't read Denise's article, that gives an excellent history, I guess, of how there has been an increased focus on the value of scholarship of teaching and the value of those academics, like myself, who's a teaching focused academic, who invests in good practice in higher education. It's an excellent piece, and also outlines, you know, some of the areas where perhaps there could be a greater attention and increased attention. It's a lovely segue to our next presenters. So I'll introduce John and Rachel, who again have written an excellent article that looks at how teaching and the scholarship of teaching is valued or not within the higher education sector. So I'll hand over to you, John and Rachel. They're still there. Hopefully they're still there. Hello, John.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I think I am still here. Thank you very much for the first two presentations. A lot of really interesting things coming out. I'm going to share some PowerPoint slides, hopefully. So there we are, share screen. Can you see a PowerPoint?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, let's have a look. That's working. Okay. Yes, I've lost some of my. Okay, that's not quite what I was expecting. Oh, it's taking a while to come back, but Rachel is on there. I don't know what's gone on there. I probably chose a template. So just to go through, I've called this a UK perspective because Rachel and I wouldn't be as bold as to claim that there is only one UK perspective, or that we have the right to speak on behalf of the UK. So that's our starting point. I'm going to do a couple of slides, then Rachel's going to come in, then I might come back in, then Rachel again. So we'll sort of, perhaps Rachel, you just let me know when you want the slide changed, and I can just operate it from here. Is probably the easiest thing to do. Okay, so the article that Sarah was referring to was a recent article in Studies in Higher Education, which was published last October. So one of the things that we, I suppose, the inspiration for this was very much a project that Rachel was sort of involved in earlier than I was, on the scholarship of learning and teaching. And as part of that, Rachel and I and others interviewed a number of sort of UK heads of educational development. And one thing that was quite clear from these interviews was that there was not so much a lack of consensus about what the scholarship of learning and teaching is, but there is also a sort of feeling that nobody really knew what it was anyway. So there was a certain lack of passion that this actually was meaningful. And we found that very, very interesting. So we had some further thoughts on it, and when we were looking through the interviews, and I suppose we had some sort of prior concerns. And I suppose one of them was just going back to Boa, who we're talking about the scholarship. There was a bit of a hierarchy there, and Rachel and I weren't the first people to observe this by any means. But there is the sort of, the way they're listed sort of implies that scholarship of discovery is the best one. That's what you do if you've got lots of resources and plenty of time and everything else, and teach scholarship of teaching is what you do if you don't have any resources to do the rest of it. So if you don't have, if you don't have the resources to do integration and what was the other one? The 4 scholarships, you kind of do teachings. That's kind of what you're left with, and I think this very fundamentally has a problematic relationship with pedagogic research or research into the teaching and learning process of higher education. And I think because of this low status of the scholarship of teaching as the 4th best scholarship, that sort of pollutes, as it were, if I want to be provocative, the whole notion of the idea of genuine research or scholarship of discovery type activities into teaching and learning in higher education. Another thing that we sort of felt as we sort of engaged with the literature around SOTL was that we believed that something had evolved from SOTL. So SOTL started off as something that was very much about research rigor, putting things in a context, making public your findings. This relates to what Greg was saying about things having outputs. What we saw was a sort of a widened understanding of SOTL, and we call this SOTL 2.0, that we felt was rather nebulous and just seemed to include absolutely everything conceivable, including stuff that never sort of left an institution, or perhaps even the mind of an individual academic could be seen as subtle under some definitions. So if you think about teaching, you could be thought to be doing subtle, even if you didn't actually sort of share that with anybody. So that's kind of part of the argument that we present in that paper. And we sort of, I think we were looking to be controversial, but we thought, well, maybe we need to get beyond Boa's work, and maybe it's is 30 years old now. It was done in the United States. Maybe it's not quite fit for purpose in a UK context. So maybe we started thinking about that, and this could actually be damaging this whole notion of the scholarship of teaching, or the scholarship of learning and teaching, or teaching and learning. Just in terms of just to relate, I suppose, provide a bit of a counterpoint to what Greg was saying. This is what we have in the United Kingdom is we have a research excellence framework, and this isn't the final say on research or what constitutes research, but interestingly, you can see in the red there, scholarship is defined as a sort of subset of research. So I don't know whether Greg will have thoughts on that, and others will have thoughts of that, but there's a very definite set of definitions about what research is and isn't. So if you look at these sorts of things that it isn't, it's very much about teaching materials, including textbooks that don't have any original research, and routine testing of and those sorts of things, maintenance of national standards, that sort of thing. Research is very much of things that have very much direct relevance to different sectors, generation of ideas, development of existing knowledge, and research is, it is something that's published and disseminated in various ways. So scholarship, interestingly, and I'm not quite sure where this comes from, but it's defined for the ref purposes as the creation, development, and maintenance of the intellectual infrastructure of subjects and disciplines in forms such as dictionaries, scholarly editions, catalogues, and contributions to major databases. Now, I'm not quite sure where this comes from, because it seems a rather specific and narrow view of what scholarship might constitute. So I'd be interested to know what Greg and others think about this. So, of course, on one hand, the REF, as we call it, the Research Excellence Framework, is not the be-all and end-all of what constitutes research and scholarship in UK universities, but it's such a powerful driver of what goes on in universities that I think we have to, taking it very seriously. And this year, in particular, our deadline, exercise happens about every 5 or 6 years on average. And we're currently coming to the end of a cycle. So we have a deadline of March 2021. So, many of our colleagues in the UK are spending a huge amount of time sort of writing lots of documents that will be, that will inform the judgments that are made in this process. I don't particularly want to develop that further, but I'll just hand on to Rachel for a moment, and then we'll, if you want to ask more about that later, you can do.
Okay, thank you. Following on from John, I'm going to briefly share what we found out about subtle activity in the daily life of academics and in institutional processes, drawing on UK experiences and international research to contribute to our discussions today. Boyer's 4 categories that underpin TEQSA's approach are part of an academic's daily life in the UK. In the UK, we have the Research Excellence Framework that John has mentioned, but we also have the Teaching Excellence Framework and the Knowledge Exchange Framework. So these form part of the policy and regulatory frameworks that frame the 4 areas of Boyer. I'm going to focus on the teaching element. And the teaching element, these policy and regulatory frameworks present opportunities for academics and institutions to make more visible, showcase, assess, subtle in relation to public accountability and fairness to students. But however, these frameworks also face translation, institutional and implementation tensions and challenges. The rationales for these frameworks are very well rehearsed. So I'm going to focus on the challenges and tensions we found in our work. Next slide, please, John. Can I change? Next slide, please.
Do you want it that way around?
Yeah, okay. What we found was that as John was saying, the previous one.
Yes. So I make it 2 slides later.
So as John was saying, what we found was there were lots of challenges and tensions around definitional issues about what subtle is. Many institutions and individuals were actually very confused about what subtle activity is. And we also found that in some institutions, individuals were undertaking subtle activity, but were not even aware that this was what subtle activity is. At an institutional level, there were policy and policy and practice gaps, in the sense that the rhetoric did not match the processes and activities and support and resourcing to be provided for subtle activity. So there were well-defined subtle policies in some institutions, not all of them, but no processes or activities and support or resourcing for subtle activity. There were also misalignments between the subtle agenda and institutional policies. So because subtle is sometimes very difficult to quantify, the notions involved with it can be quite difficult for individuals. These are sometimes pitched against institutional processes that focus on more exacting and quantifiable metrics, part of a managerialist agenda. We also found that there's definitely some need to build subtle capacity, both for individuals and institutions, around how to actually enact subtle and how to develop it and develop a culture within the institution for enacting SOTL and measuring it as well. Next slide, please, John. In terms of tensions, what we found was that individuals tended to say that they just did not have the time to engage in scholarly activity. So there was some ambivalence in engaging with SOTL activity in some institutions and departments, but also institutions were continually witnessing an increasing willingness to engage in SOTL activity. But again, the time constraints were a problem. Another challenge was financial resources. Funding is quite limited, particularly for teaching and learning and educational development activities. And that's been dwindling over the years. So this affected individuals and institutions' ability to actually engage in SOTL activity. There are also research teaching tensions. These tensions play out in that research is often considered more prestigious and offered a higher status than teaching in some higher educational institutions. So individuals would rather focus on research and research outputs rather than scholarly activity around teaching. Next slide, please. So this raises some questions about for teaching-only staff. Is the research teaching nexus undermined if you're teaching only? Or does SOTL actually strengthen the link between research and teaching? Another question it raises is, how does research-led teaching sit with teaching only? Also, do teaching-only staff have fewer opportunities to demonstrate scholarly activity in relation to Boyer's category when it comes to promotion, particularly in research-intensive institutions? I'm now just going to hand over to John to jump in to talk a little bit more about the implications for teaching-only staff.
Yes, so I think it's important to realise that teaching-only academics are, that's not necessarily a choice that people make. And certainly in our institution at the University of Brighton, we're sometimes called a new university, even though it's nearly 30 years ago it was designated a university. So sometimes teaching-only academics are active researchers who end up in teacher-only posts because that's what they can get. So, for example, if you look at teaching fellow posts at research-intensive universities, you'll find that a PhD is essential or desirable for most jobs in those sorts of places. But not only that, a record of publication is as well. So there is a sort of situation where the notion of teaching only is a function of job market and economy. It has got nothing really to do with scholarship and a sort of active decision on behalf of anybody to pursue a particular route. So yeah, I mean, I was just looking at some current job adverts, and if you type in something like teaching fellow and into jobs.ac.uk and sort of look at the requirements for those positions, you'll find they don't look any different from requirements for mixed teaching and research posts, for example.
It's also important to note what the implications are for casual staff or hourly paid lecturers. What we found was that most of them said they had little time for scholarly activities. They also felt that there wasn't sufficient resourcing for scholarly activity. And also the tensions played out about, you know, whether you focus on research or teaching, because research is more prestigious. There was also some difficulty around whether subtle activities could actually be measured. Next slide. So one of the questions the organizers asked us to look at was about measurement and whether all scholarly activity can be measured. Well, as Greg said, no. What we found is that the narrow and broader measures of outcomes and impact in relation to scholarly activities. So the narrow ones related mainly to our metrics and bibliometrics, so citations. But that raised raises some issues around certain activities. So for example, if you've published an article, how sure are you who has actually used and taken on some of the ideas? So for example, academics may use your ideas and develop their curriculum, drawing on your work, but then they don't publish it. So you have no way of knowing that your impact in that kind of way. So this Medina refers to as an article utility, and that is a missing metric in many measures of scholarly impact and outcomes. By its very nature, scholarly activity needs broader measures of assessment of activity. Nicholas, for example, argues for more approaches of assessment that include, for example, mentoring, peer reviewing, collaboration, and outreach. And this should surely be the case because the impacts are much broader when it comes to scholarly activity around teaching, because it's about teaching and learning outcomes. There are also some often hidden and sometimes convoluted areas of social impact that can sometimes be very difficult to measure in the sorts of frameworks that we have here in the UK. There's also the issue around time lag that applies to metrics. So for example, if you publish a paper and then it's 10 years before the ideas are taken over, that demonstrates how sometimes you're not able to actually measure timely what the impact and outcomes are. I think that is time for us. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, both of you, for elaborating on some important research that was published in your recent article. And as I shared before, I really liked your very clear explanation of SOTL 1.0 and 2.0. And again, it's, getting at the heart of, first of all, valuing really good teaching in higher ed, but then also having a really stronger value on those who are engaging in, I guess, more rigorous pedagogic research. So I'm going to open it up now to questions, and I have also been looking at the chat. So I've copied and pasted over a couple of questions that have already come through. So I'll put those up, and we can start with those if we like, and then I'll take them from the floor. Okay. So this one is for Greg. So could Greg perhaps at some point say whether the outcome of the consultation is likely to focus on quality assurance, making sure all providers have a minimum standard of scholarship, or quality enhancement, improving the quality of scholarship, all sorts of issues of measurement here across all institutions?
So the simple answer is it relates to quality assurance, because the discussion paper and the guidance note relate to the standards, and the standards are a minimum requirement. So we would like to think that the sector themselves would have aspire beyond the minimum standards and consider quality enhancement themselves. And I take Denise's point. There would be providers who have a very mature and best practice approach to some of this work, and for them, it's probably an issue of maintenance, not continuous improvement. It's around maintaining already high standards. But I also have the sense, as someone who's worked in the sector for a long period of time, that there is significant quality enhancement work that should occur within, in relation to fostering a environment of scholarship rather than just one of research output and research income. So I do get the sense that there's improvement for the sector to make, and that can be made. That's not to say that we don't have leaders across the sector or that providers aren't meeting the minimum standards. But our role as a regulator is ensuring that the minimum standards are met, so it's a quality assurance role.
Okay, thank you, Greg. We have another question which was addressed in the last part of that presentation, but whether there is further comments that can be made from our panellists around the issue of casual staff, first of all, and within the Australian context specifically, a large percentage of our teaching is taken over by the casual staff. So what does this mean? But of course, there's also the teaching focused academic track as well, that I can talk, you know, personally, my university is very much encouraged and valued. Our provost here at UniSA has a very strong commitment to the teaching focused track being an actual promising career progression pathway. And he has resourced that, you know, very strongly. However, that might not be the case across all universities. So would anyone else like to make a comment about that?
I can. I think this is a particularly tricky area, and I say this as someone who actually started off as a casual member or hourly paid member of staff. I haven't seen any good practices personally, or heard of good practices within universities, but maybe other people might have. I just universities are quite different, higher education providers.
Could I offer, Sarah?
Yes, go for it.
Yeah. Okay. There's been several projects on looking at sessional staff, casual staff projects around Australia. And typically there's a whole lot of examples of good practice. QUT used to have a really active supporting program for casual and staff. They had a sessional staff association that had money. They ran a conference. They were paid for attending conferences and so on. But they tend to, while there's lots of different examples that you can find where staff are paid to attend training, to be supported but they tend to be shorter lived. They're not ongoing forever. So it often depends on the leadership. So just as you've said for your university, your DVC is very keen, and he has been right from the start, and I congratulate him and the university on progressing that. The question is, does it remain when those people leave? And so that becomes problematic. And then you look at, say, other private providers where casual staff are really employed to teach the model, and therefore their contribution to being scholarly perhaps is not required, expected, or even encouraged to a degree, you know. So it does really vary, but we have always and continue to treat our casual and sessional staff badly. And I've been looking at this issue, and since 2002, I think we did the first report, and there's been several since. The issues are exactly the same. They are under-recognised, underpaid, under-supported, and it goes on and on and on. And I think it's something that really the sector should be ashamed of, because it just hasn't addressed it systematically and properly. In fact, all they've done is reduce number of permanent staff, increase casual and sessional, and provide nothing to support them.
But Denise, what do you think we should be doing to solve that problem? Do you think that's something that the sector is capable of fixing themselves, or is it something that needs to be imposed on the sector?
One thing that, and others may want to come in, but a really interesting thing, I don't know if you remember the Learning and Teaching Performance Fund, and stage one was that you had to have professional development training for sessional staff. It was one of those hurdle requirements. Lo and behold, all universities put one in, and they had to keep it in. Learning and Teaching Performance Fund stopped and it dropped off. So, you know, making things a hurdle requirement, and particularly for funding, would be, you know, a really wonderful thing, because those things matter. And again, if we take, you know, some institutions deal with it and want it by leadership, but then it changes. So I think making it a hurdle requirement is critical. Demonstrate how you support your casual staff and how these aspects are built in. And that's a minimum standard. If not, they will continue to be left out. They're not often even included in any assessment process around scholarship or around research. They're sort of disappeared people.
So I presume that would also extend to private providers in your ideal world, who typically don't receive government funds at this point. But some kind of scheme of incentivising this practice would be something you'd favour.
A number of the private providers I've worked with, in fact, are quite diligent in providing, for example, a minimum training for their tutors and so on, to ensure their particular model and standard is met. So some of them, I think, are doing better than some of the universities. So I don't see, I mean, it's a quality control, it's a quality enhancement, it's a quality assurance mechanism to make sure that staff are at least on the same page for how teaching is to be delivered. But then there is an employer obligation that I think we expect of industries, but we don't ask of our higher education institutions.
Yes, absolutely. Did anyone else on the panel want to make a comment about that one before I open it up for other questions?
Yeah, I could just say, you know, I think as you know, good point made by Amy in the comments, and people on the sort of what we call hourly paid lecturers, is generally what we call them at our university, is that they have a lack of, it's not so much there's a lack of access to professional development, but they can become invisible for the institution, or the professional development frameworks we have you know, are sort of aimed at you know, an assumption that you have a certain amount of teaching and you have a certain type of contract and can provide a certain amount of evidence. So, you know, there's often, you know, an exclusion from certain activities as well. Not always deliberate, but some of these things indirectly exclude. And the other thing is that, you know, that there are particular groups in our society who are disproportionately represented amongst the hourly paid lecturers. So there are disproportionately people of colour who are lecturers who are on these sorts of contracts, disproportionately women, disproportionately younger academics as well. So there are other sorts of issues there as well.
Okay, so if anyone has a question they would like to ask, feel free to turn your video on and unmute yourself. The floor is yours. If there's anything that has come up today.
One of the things I wanted to raise, and it's not necessarily one that can be answered, but I think needs to be considered, is that casual staff, as we move more and more onto online delivery, what happens to casual staff when they deliver their content and then that is recorded and used repeatedly. It's just another example of some of the issues that casual staff face.
Yeah. I think COVID has also been very destructive for the casual teaching force. Obviously, they were the first ones to lose their jobs. And then, yeah, the digital shift has meant, either a huge increased workload for continuing staff, as well as you say, Jane, the casual staff have been exploited for that. Any other questions from our audience? Deb?
Yeah, I have one, and it comes into this sort of casual area, but not quite. Because we've been talking mostly about universities, and I don't think any of them have the model that some of the other accredited organisations have or are moving to, which is rather than actually employing casuals, they're using independent contractors for teaching. So I'd be interested in Greg's comments about how that sits with what TEQSA sees in terms of how scholarship should be spread throughout an organisation.
So rather than give you an official TEQSA view on that, I'll give you a personal view on that. Deborah, as someone who works within TEQSA, I don't see it any different in terms of the use of casuals. I think anyone who's engaged in delivering curriculum to students should be people who are participating and are encouraged through a clear institutional approach to participate in a culture of scholarship that is a meaningful culture of scholarship. And I don't get the sense that that is done well across the sector personally. I think there's a lot of improvement that needs to occur. And I think it's a very difficult time for that to happen. The environment is about as bad as it could get to start to look at doing some of this work, but it's important. I think it goes to the very nature of higher education and what it means to deliver higher education. And I think we owe it to our students and the people who work bloody hard to deliver higher education across this country to do a bit better.
Thank you. And from a very personal point of view, I totally agree with you. Not speaking for any organisation. And it's really an artificial construct anyway, but there you are. Good, thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Any other questions?
Oh, that's a nice one.
Hi, Claire.
I might just put a question to the host there. Aggravated or accelerated by the pandemic is, as was reported in the Australian yesterday, a move for institutions to outsource some of their online course development. I find it quite scary, even though I am myself involved in a lot of online curriculum development, but there are really strong implications for what is teaching, what is the scholarship of the job if you're not involved in curriculum creation and so on. So I don't know if anyone would like to speak to that from the UK. I know that was kind of intimated from your research, but you spoke to that, Rachel.
Do you want me to give you my take on that, Claire?
Sure, go for it.
So I think that first and foremost, if a provider decides to outsource their curriculum development, it's their curriculum, which they need to take responsibility for. So they therefore need to assure themselves that the standards are being met and that curriculum is informed by scholarship. That's appropriate. So that's impossible unless there's infrastructure in place to assess the product of that outsourced curriculum development. And so if it's cheap and nasty, someone else can do the job and I really don't know what I'm getting back, then you're not meeting the standards. So you don't abrogate yourself the responsibilities under standards by outsourcing. So that's the first comment I made. That's not to say you can't successfully outsource curriculum development, particularly around digital learning. That's time consuming, expensive stuff. But then that's only one part of the experience. People who teach need to interpret that curriculum in a way that's meaningful for students, and therefore they need to be across that content, and they need to be informed themselves, and they need to be supported and fostered to do the job properly.
Yeah, I think at my institution, they are doing that sort of support for the delivery, support for the academics very well. There's a lot of subtle support, training and so on. But speaking to colleagues elsewhere, it's perhaps not so much. The teaching component is, if you like, they've turned into facilitators, deliverers, rather than what we might see as fully rounded and informed teaching positions. It's a challenge.
I must admit, one of the words I don't like in academia is the idea of delivery, because I think that sort of sounds like you discover products that you're sort of you know, just like taking something from one place to another. And yeah, I've got a sort of thing on my blog of words I don't like, which I contribute to occasionally, and I put delivery in one of these. So maybe that's part of the problem. If we talk about delivery, we're sort of you know, perhaps asking for those sorts of things to be outsourced.
Speaks to that sort of unbundling of the professional components, which should be course curriculum, you know, in a perfect world, the whole gig, rather than just unbundled bits you make, you deliver.
It's the Uber of education. Is that kind of how you can frame that one? Any other questions? I've just got some videos that have come on. Marina, did you have a question?
No, I don't have a question.
Okay, no worries. And Julia?
Yeah, well, it's more of a comment really. Just recently, I've been working with our Indigenous Pro-Vice Chancellor and talking a lot about transformational learning from an Indigenous perspective. And it's striking me that a lot of the language and what we're using is very transactional and counterintuitive for groups such as Indigenous students and staff who wish to teach in a way that goes beyond what we understand, is the way we've always taught in a very Western way. I'm struggling a little bit, and you know that word delivery is one of those words for me too, that's so far from the experience we want to give students sometimes. So yeah, it's just a bit of confusion in my head about I guess frameworks and positions of what the experience we want students to have, and therefore what's the skill and knowledge and teaching and learning background we need our staff to have to deliver that really profound experience that we might want students to have. I don't know the answer to that question. It's just a reflection.
That's yes, I concur with you on all of those points, Julia.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions? Yes.
I'll make some comments if that's all right.
Yeah.
Firstly, thank you everybody for raising the issue of sessional staff, something that I continue to be passionate about. I would have to absolutely concur with Denise's argument of a need for hurdles to ensure standards of quality learning and teaching with our sessional staff and to support them with the SOTL. The comment that I've put in the chat is, to me, one of the big problems that we have as a sector is we've never done any robust costing on sessional staff. I believe we're working with a false assumption that sessional staff are cheap. Yet if we, you know, I've had some like departments within different universities do quick costings, comparing it to put them on a one-year contract or something else. And there are actually, the cost savings are not there. And we're not thinking more broadly in terms of the enhancement of the curriculum quality and so forth. And I could go on about that for hours. I think we need robust costing measures, and we don't have robust costing measures or any measures to start with because we have so little data on our sessional staff. And that's another thing, and that's really ad hoc across universities. If we don't know them, how do we support them with SOTL? And we don't know them. And I'll never forget that I was in a room once with dozens of DVCs, and I asked them to each share with me one fact about sessional staff in their organisation. And there was, out of all the people in the room, there was one DVC who was able to give me a fact. There is an almost blatant and willful ignorance. They don't want to know, because then they don't have to deal with it. How's that? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Yes, I think, as Denise said, there is increased focus of the casual sessional experience, and perhaps that's something that collectively HERDSA can put some attention into. Now, there was a question in the chat that I missed, which may be for you, Greg. I've just screen shared. What is expected for the higher ed provider to provide evidence of their actual provision for scholarship and research?
So what's expected?
Yes.
Quite simply, that the provider has a way of assuring themselves that they're meeting that standard. So what's your approach as a provider to meeting this standard? How do you assure yourselves that that standard is being met? And so providers have different approaches to this, different missions. We're not aiming to be prescriptive, and that's not our approach as a regulator. But what we see is a lot of providers who tell us they're excellent in scholarship, but they have no real way to back that statement up, other than provide their research output. So the whole point of the discussion paper was to start to provoke some thinking in this area, and particularly boards of providers to start to take this issue a little bit more seriously, and to start an internal discussion around what scholarship means to them, how they're going to invest in scholarship, and how they're going to assure themselves, if they're not about continuous improvement, that they're about maintenance of excellence.
Excellent.
Greg, my university has just moved this year to say that scholarship is included in the teaching allocation, and previously it wasn't. And I'm concerned by that, because I think that provides actually no evidence that there's any support for scholarship at all.
Sorry, is that you, Bev?
Yeah, it is.
Yep.
Sorry,
G'day.
and the teaching specialists at my university are denied doing research, and in fact we've had research deleted from our profile webpage, and so so that there's no evidence that there's support for that either. And even if we're supervising PhDs and EdDs, we still have research deleted. And that, I think that's significantly problematic. I put in a response to the review, and I think there's a significant issue there in terms of universities not really providing, a university not really providing any evidence.
Yeah, it kind of goes beyond just, saying we want more, we want more from our staff for the same, and we're not going to invest anything more into it.
Yeah.
So, we used to employ you on a casual contract. Now that casual contract says you're also going to do scholarship, but nothing else changes. That's not meaningful.
Yeah.
So there needs to be support, there needs to be strategy, there needs to be engagement across the institution to do this stuff meaningfully. But there's lots of templates that get created at big institutions, often in areas that are quite distant from where the actual work happens, and sometimes it's pragmatic, sometimes it's not. But our expectation is that our institutions are mature enough and have the resources available to it. If they tackle this seriously, they can do it meaningfully.
That's obviously in some cases not the case. So what then happens?
Well, what then happens is if ultimately if a provider's not able to meet the standards for registration, then we would engage with them in a way that's appropriate under our legislation. We'd like to think that it wouldn't get to that. Universities tend to be very responsive when we raise concerns about issues under the standards. We have a pretty high-performing, stable sector, I have to say, from a regulatory sense. But we're also at a time of great change, and the old model is kind of getting broken, and no one knows what the new model will be. So it is very challenging for everybody in the sector. We recognise that. But just creating a template or changing what you expect from your staff without creating an environment for that change to occur and occur well isn't probably effective management. It's not our job to run institutions, but it's our job to ensure that the institutions are running themselves well.
Yes, that's a good point, Greg. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. If there's no other questions, I might just finish off with probably the most provocative question that's on that slide, which is about the measurement of scholarship. So is all scholarship measurable, and must it be? And this can be our closing thoughts and comments from our panellists.
So I think I've already given you a no and a no, but some of it should be, more of it should be. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Denise?
Measurable's interesting. Can you always count it? No, but you can document it. And so we need to think more about terms rather than outputs, which are in a way measurable. Outcomes can be recorded in different ways. And so the reason it's not is because the institutions have been reluctant to expand. I keep pointing out that research has a lot of countable metrics because they've invested vast amounts of money over the last 30, 40 years to count them and to set up panels and to agree with what's countable and what they all can be quantified at. None of that effort has been put into teaching and into scholarship. And so it's vast amounts of what we do in scholarly work, scholarly practice and scholarship, then that can be documented in categorical senses. And we don't put any effort into it. So it's more an institutional reluctance to do so rather than the fact it's not happening or that it can't be done.
Excellent. Okay, John?
Yeah, it's a horrible question, and I think one of the things we sort of alluded to, in some ways I don't like the idea of answering it, but one of the things is about the impact over time of a particular piece of work. And, you know, I don't know about your context, but our research excellence framework sort of, you know, you put things that have been published, you know, so this paper that I've done with Rachel might go into that and people will look at it, and it was only published in October, but it won't be looked at, or it won't be part of, you know, the next one. So if a lot of people cited it, or a lot of people engaged with it, or found it interesting, or got very angry about it, you know, then it's, you know, there's nothing that will be measured in 5, 10, 15 years time, you know, about that. So there's a sort of problem here of time lag, you know, about sort of working out which papers are very important and which are sort of maybe less so. I don't know, I just think that that's a sort of more fundamental part, is about the sort of long-term impact of something rather than whether somebody thinks it's a good paper now. But we probably, yes, so if it's good in 40 years time, we can say that was a good piece of work.
Okay, thank you. Rachel, to finish us off?
Okay, yes. There's been a tendency to focus on the more quantifiable measures and metrics, often because that's quite easy. What I found very interesting with the TEQSA approach is there appears to be much more scope to look at different models. So that's quite a promising direction as far as I can see.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you to our panelists for your time. There is, you know, people probably up now at 1 o'clock in the morning. So thank you, John and Rachel. Go to bed now. And Denise, thank you for getting up early. And just a little plug also. So we have our conference that is scheduled for face-to-face, the HERDSA conference. So please look out for that. And also, I think that there is definitely a need to run a session around professional development for casual staff. So the HERDSA branch chair will look into organising something in that area. And good luck with your next adventure, Greg.
Thank you.
Yes, we really appreciate all of your time. So thank you, everybody. Okay. And have a good weekend.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you too. Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you. You did a really good job. Well done.
Thank you.